Welcome to Arch's lecture, Roosevelt Barnes Sr. and the Ongoing Struggle Against Restrictive Racial Covenants. This is a part of Arch's 2023 lecture series. It tells the story of a builder, a neighborhood, and a heritage, and is being presented by me, Connie Haas-Suber, the Executive Director of Arch, Inc. Originally presented on February 18, 2023, in the Spectator Lounge of Cinema Center on East Berry Street. Arch's lecture series continues the third Saturday of every month through May. These presentations are free, and you are welcome to join us for any of them. This series is called Arch's Fun and Free Lecture Series. This series is Arch's gift of education to the community. It is made possible by volunteers and the members and donors who support our operations and staff. And this year's lecture series, the 2023 series, is also supported by funding from Arch United of Greater Fort Wayne, the Community Foundation of Greater Fort Wayne, and Indiana Humanities. Everyone who enjoys this lecture is invited to invest in history for our future and donate to Arch. You will be supporting this program and all that Arch and its historic preservation work contributes to community well-being in Fort Wayne and Northeast Indiana. And we're also eager to hear your reviews of this program and your ideas for what Arch could be doing to make an even bigger impact. So let's talk in person, by phone, or email. Go back to the website where you found this lecture to find the email address to get in contact. Thank you very much for your feedback. We really appreciate it. So now let's get going on our presentation for the day. The first question to answer is, why present this lecture now? The answer is there are two coinciding factors, because in so many ways, the story has been compelling and important and deserving of community-wide attention and consideration ever since it began. But these two factors told me that now was the time to stop waiting and start talking. Factor number one is 2023 is the 75th anniversary of the 1948 U.S. Supreme Court ruling that restrictive racial covenants and property deeds cannot be enforced. Racial covenants are one component of the net of discriminatory practices that restricted a variety of people's abilities to own and improve real estate. Jews, Latinos, people of Eastern European descent, Romani, people of Asian descent. I've seen deeds referring to them as the Mongoloid race, and especially Blacks. The deed to my house includes such covenants. Yours may well too. They were standard additions to plats and deeds for a long time, especially after 1927, when the National Association of Real Estate Boards, now the National Association of Realtors, created model language to use. Here's what it said. No part of said premises shall be sold, given, conveyed, or leased to any Negro or Negroes. According to a 2021 New York Times article from which I draw this history, in 2020, the National Association of Realtors issued a formal apology for its past racial actions. That Supreme Court ruling should be understood as merely a tiny crack in the edifice of discrimination, not a landscape-changing victory. Covenants are not like laws for which you can be arrested and prosecuted. A private person would have to take you to court over violation, alleging damages by your actions. Nevertheless, these covenants undoubtedly were and remain for a long time a powerful signal to potential property buyers. This year is also the 55th anniversary of the passage of the Federal Fair Housing Act, which made racial covenants and a number of other discriminatory practices illegal. Factor two, Indiana Landmarks, the statewide historic preservation nonprofit of which Arch is an affiliate member and longtime partner, has launched the Black Heritage Preservation Program specifically to ensure that stories like these and places like Barnes Built are preserved and celebrated and not lost. Arch is honored to participate in the Fort Wayne Project Committee and has received grant funding to do foundational survey work to document this neighborhood and begin the preservation of its story and, we hope, the houses that Barnes's construction company built. Therefore, today we are doing Roosevelt Barnes Sr. Ongoing Struggle Against restrictive racial covenants. We're going to be approaching this big topic in three parts. First, we'll talk about the situation as the story begins. Then we'll meet the man himself, and then we'll talk about the neighborhood he built. First, the situation, because we really need context to understand what Roosevelt Barnes faced as he started his work. So what I did to get my own self set to think about this was I went to our library's wonderful Allen County Community Album photo database online and typed in Fort Wayne 1957. That's the year Barnes founded his company. And I think we should orient ourselves to the local situation then. I chose these three images as representative of what popped up. They are on the left. A photo caption, "Gift locomotive arrives in Fort Wayne." This one-time Wabash Railroad engine was, excuse me, built by the American Locomotive Company at Schenectady, New York in 1906, and was used by the Wabash Railroad until 1952, when it was transferred to Fort Wayne for use on a local switch line, the Lake Erie and Fort Wayne. This photo was taken May 8th, 1957. The caption says the engine was going to be placed for display at Sweeney Park, and this action being depicted is preparation to lift the engine off the tracks at the Fulton Street crossing of the nickel plate tracks. Down on the bottom is a postcard of the then brand new Concordia Lutheran High School from the Harder postcard collection, and that is dated August 15, 1957. Up at the top right, you see a photo, undoubtedly for a scrapbook or maybe even the society section of the newspaper, of the American Legion Auxiliary Unit 47 Planning Committee preparing for the 38th Legion birthday party to be held March 28, 1957. From left to right in the front row are Mrs. Clarence Anderson, Brian Sweeney, Mrs. J.H. Wright, and Mrs. Peggy Jurgens, and in the back row are Clarence Anderson and Paul Hartford. Look at these pictures, study them all carefully, and you come up with a question. That question is, where are the Black faces? Good question. It's got a complicated answer that can be summarized as largely invisible to the daily life of the white populace. And these are the factors leading to that answer. And we'll go through these one by one. First of all, segregated geographically. Hannah Stith, a teacher and community leader who wrote the chapter Illuminating an Ignored Legacy, the African-American History of Fort Wayne for the 2006 History of Fort Wayne in Allen County, Indiana, 1790 to 2005, published by the Allen County Fort Wayne Historical Society and the County Genealogical Society, passed away in 2018 at age 90. She is also the person who, with her husband Harold and others, was instrumental in the creation of the African-American Historical Museum on East Douglas Street. Her memories, presented in that published work and via a personal interview that Tolani Rasaki and Angie Quinn conducted while researching an Arch publication, The Journey for Civil Rights in Fort Wayne, a context study in 2010, affirm the geographical segregation of the Black from the white communities of Fort Wayne from the 1920s into the 1960s. Not only were African Americans concentrated, she said, just south and east of downtown from Bar Street to Anthony Boulevard, and on the near west side in an area bounded by the Pennsylvania Railroad tracks between Freeman and McKinley Streets, but given they were uniformly unwelcome in white places of business, they patronized a small Black commercial area known as the Avenue, the 2 blocks near the intersection of Lafayette and Brackenridge Streets. Mrs. Stith remembers the roster of businesses there, as including several beauty shops and restaurants and an upscale nightclub featuring recognized musicians from across the nation. The Phyllis Wheatley Center, now the museum, was nearby on Douglas Street as a center of recreational and social activities, and the neighborhood had grocery stores and churches too. The Stith family lived across the street from the Center Now Museum. Their family home is gone now, as is the Avenue, but the Stith's daughter Robin fondly remembers the neighborhood she grew up in before they moved to a Barnes-built house in Southern Heights, when she visited Fort Wayne to attend the 2021 dedication of Douglas Street from Calhoun to Hannah as Harold and Hannah Stith Memorial Parkway. Robin noted the community of close families there and amenities like a doctor's office, pharmacy, and 2 grocery stores. The white community, meanwhile, had no idea. Second point, overcrowded in substandard housing and cost burdened. A meticulous analysis of U.S. Census housing data by Richard Summerfield Associates, commissioned in 1963 by the Fort Wayne Urban League, is presented in the report, The Socioeconomic Circumstances of Negroes in Fort Wayne, Indiana, 1963. Summerfield demonstrated how Fort Wayne's Negro residents were more tightly packed into their residence than the city's whites, who enjoyed 50% more space per person. And he said this, I quote, "Negroes proportionately pay more for their housing and get less in return than do the whites. At the same time, Negroes are investing a greater amount of their income in housing than are whites," he writes. To a considerable extent, that portion of Fort Wayne that's populated most heavily by Negroes is the section of the city that has the lowest quality housing. He cited census research that assessed almost 1 out of every 2 Negro housing units as unsound, compared to only 1 out of every 8 white housing units. Now the map is relevant. A much higher percentage of Black families than white families lived in rental housing. So he did a study of rental housing occupied by Blacks and created this map. The detail is hard to see at a distance, but when you lean in and look, you can see that it is populated by asterisks and pluses. The asterisks are locations of Negro-occupied rental properties in October of 1963. They are clustered, as Mrs. Stith told us to expect, south of the railroad tracks, downtown in between Bar Street and South Anthony, and really Hannah, largely, with a few others elsewhere. Then you've got to start looking for the pluses, because this is the residence of the owners of those rental properties. And those are scattered widely, with a few among the predominance of rental properties, but most of them not. So people elsewhere, meaning probably white people in this time, when because segregation was very much a reality then, owned the houses that they were renting to Black people in that area. Moving on through this list, under or unemployed as job discrimination persisted. That Urban League study, Stith's essay, and much other research tells the story of Fort Wayne's African American struggle to rise from the bottom rung of menial jobs to well-paying jobs here. The World War II war effort was a temporary help. The ground was lost when available jobs went to returning military veterans, and the city actually lost manufacturing jobs post-war. State and federal fair employment laws had been passed in the 1940s, but enforcement was lacking. New and more comprehensive laws were adopted in the 1960s, leaving decades of entrenched practices and prejudices still to be overcome. These 3 big factors were reality, despite factor number 4, the Black population in Fort Wayne being a quickly growing minority in the city. In 1920, it had been only 1.7% of the population. By 1950, it was 4%, and by 1960, it had nearly doubled to 7.2% of the population. A recipe for change was coming together. Summerfield said, given the total base of income and housing in Fort Wayne, it would seem possible to regard Negroes as an exploited economic and housing group within the total population of Fort Wayne. Such exploitation is not uncommon for Negroes, but the actual figures make Fort Wayne something less than a, quote, summit city, unquote, as far as the income and housing treatment of Negroes may be concerned. Factors that had delayed change were becoming levers of change. Fort Wayne had a history of polite liberal interracialism. For example, the leaders of the Black community and the leaders of the white community would would speak to each other, and they had some very well respected interracial dialogues and brought speakers to town and things like that. But it turned out to be talk, and nothing really changed afterwards. But it set up this idea in the white population that, oh, our Black people are happy. They talk to us. They seem to be content with their lot and don't really have higher aspirations. But the Black population, with things like the Urban League study, was accumulating data to counter these standard practices and was recognizing its real needs with information to back them up. And it was beginning to push back again in a society that was finally beginning to move with it. Summerfield argued that Fort Wayne's Negroes understood their situation quite clearly and were not at all complacent, much more clearly, in fact, than the white community did. For example, in relation to housing, which is today's focus, he said, quote, "For Negroes, achievement is limited both by present occupation and by cost of housing in relation to income. Should these Negroes happen by one means or another to achieve financial strength, they are not in a position to be able to obtain the housing of their desire. If such is the case, then the, quote, contentment, unquote, of Fort Wayne Negroes with their present housing is actually more of an accurate assessment of their role in the total community than it is an expression of apathy or negativism. Further, as a subcommunity, Negroes, like any other subcommunity, need internal leadership if they are socially to advance as a group." The leader stepped forward. Here's how Roosevelt Barnes Sr. explained his decision in a presentation to Hannah's class that he made sometime in 1967 or whatever. "Realizing the problems that Negroes have in purchasing quality housing, both older and new homes, I decided to go into the business of general contracting, the building of new homes as well as remodeling older homes." Therefore, today, the man we are honoring today is Roosevelt Barnes Sr. And now it's time to get to know him. I think a good way to do that is with some family pictures that his eldest daughter, Ann Barnes Smith, was kind enough to share with me. Here they are, a lifetime of photos. In the center, we have a lovely Olin Mills family portrait. I like that they're wearing color coordinated outfits and the happy smiles. It's just beautiful. On the right is a nice portrait of Roosevelt Barnes Sr. as a young man, likely from close to the time he was meeting his wife and starting his business career. And on the left, we see Barnes as a distinguished elder. This is the obituary published in Frost Illustrated. It was written by his eldest daughter, Anne. Let me read to you how she told his personal story. "Fort Wayne lost one of its pioneering Black entrepreneurs last week. Roosevelt Barnes Sr., 85, born January 12, 1923, was the fourth of 11 children born to Willie Ann Sims Barnes and Willie Barnes in Uniontown, Alabama, in Perry County. He departed this life on Tuesday, September 11, after an extended illness. As a youth, Barnes was a hardworking individual. He left home at the age of 16 to work in Ensley, Alabama, outside of Birmingham. At the age of 18, he came to Fort Wayne to visit his uncles. Because he needed transportation, his uncle offered him the use of his car. While dropping this uncle off at the old Studebaker plant, Barnes was offered a job making $1.10 in Fort Wayne versus 28 cents an hour in Alabama. He was working at Studebaker by 5 p.m. that evening. He was later quoted as saying, "Quite naturally, I chose to stay in Fort Wayne." During his years in Alabama, Barnes acquired skills in all types of interior decorating and painting. He continued to exercise his skills in decorating as a secondary means of employment while working at Studebaker. When the Studebaker plant went out of business, Barnes went to the heat treating department of International Harvester. Reevaluating his situation, he decided to start painting houses, barns, churches, and anything else that came along. He began to build a working relationship with fellow tradesmen and clients. This relationship led to Barnes being hired by Mr. Kurtz, who owned a plastering company. There, Barnes added the skill of plastering to his many construction repertoires. Upon the retirement of Mr. Kurtz, Barnes started Barnes Plastering Company. In 1956, he built his first house, which led to the business becoming Barnes Construction Company. 1956 actually was a big year. On August 11th of that year, he was united in marriage with Anna Lou Tubbs. To this union of 51 years was born 3 children, Anne and her 2 brothers, Roosevelt Jr. and Donald. Anne, who shared her memories and her archive of her father's papers with us recently, remembers her father as an observant man, persistent, and the sort who saw doubt, resistance, and obstacles as challenges to be overcome. He could just figure things out, she said, and the family would, not really jokingly, tell him he was a genius. Notably, Anne introduced us to one of his home building clients who told us the story of her home and who volunteered her own judgment that Mr. Barnes was a genius. I asked her where he got the design for her home, and she said she and her husband designed it, and he built what they wanted. Anne was not surprised. She said she remembers seeing a couple of books of house plans in his home office, and she knows he used and could read blueprints because they're a necessary part of communicating with subcontractors, but she agreed he generally built to what his clients said they wanted. The client we met remembers her Barnes house fondly for the high quality of its craftsmanship. It was a warm house, she said, and a quiet one. Barnes insulated exterior and interior walls, Anne said, leaving her shocked by the noise that carried through the first non-Barnes house she bought. The obituary tribute that Anne wrote concludes with, Barnes was one of the pioneers in the community, opening the doors for Black businessmen and families. He fought to develop the Southern Heights neighborhood where he built 26 houses that allowed Black families to have upscale housing. He owned and operated Food Lanes, the only Black-owned supermarket in Fort Wayne. He was the general contractor for the statewide renovations of Miller's Mary Manor and the construction of 4 Black churches in the community. He provided employment, encourage, and opportunity for many individuals in the community for 40 years. Barnes was active in the church and was an amazing father with compassion for family. She includes a list of family down to 3 great-grandchildren in the recitation of people left to cherish his memory, and she completes the list with, and a host of other relatives and friends. People were important in Roosevelt Barnes's life, and they were important in his work, which involved from his personal education in the construction trades to master of being a general contractor with big statewide contracts. His first jobs were more hands-on than his eventual work process when he acted as general contractor, working with trusted subcontractors for electrical, plumbing, and even landscaping work. But I do not want us to lose sight of what was his larger purpose, nor to skip over the very serious challenges of the environment in which his new business was going to be operating. He had a big job ahead of him in many ways. Once again, from his Hannah Stift class presentation, he said, being a Negro and venturing into a field such as the building of new homes in an almost totally white environment, I encountered many difficulties. Now it's time for us to move on to learning about the neighborhood he built. It's one of those twisted ironies or something that the neighborhood Barnes chose to develop, Southern Heights, had restrictive racial covenants filed with its original 1924 plat, which I'm showing here. The tiny little print on the side includes the line, no lots shall be sold to colored people under penalty of forfeiture on the part of buyer to this contract or the forfeiture of title to said lot. Barnes also bought and developed lots in 3 adjoining plats that are now understood as part of the Southern Heights neighborhood. They are Popular Edition, platted in 1917 from Paulding Road north up Smith Street, which is to the east side of this plat, with no covenants at all. Zumbrin and Underhill Edition, a tiny plat filed in 1947 with no racial covenant, but one against business, quote, of an objectionable nature, which would have been a challenge to enforce. And that was kind of right in the middle, tucked in there between Popular and this one. And Philly's Homestead, 2 blocks of small lots going east on Hawthorne, which is south of here, from the point where Hannah Street and Decatur Road meet, platted in 1939. Sadly, the page of what may well be covenants is illegible in the online Philly's Homestead plat record, so I can't tell what it says, though the date makes a restrictive racial covenant possible, if not likely. But before we get all wrapped up trying to picture and understand all these different plats and where and when they were, let's step back and recognize that the neighborhood worked out with a lot of changes. First of all, the entire north end of the Southern Heights plat was replaced in 1955. You can see the big open space at the top of this map here, when Fort Wayne Community Schools built Southern Heights Elementary School, now Levon Scott Academy, at 950 East Fairfax Avenue. Another chunk of single-family home lots along East Belmont became a mobile home park, and you can see all the little bitty spots just south of the school area as the mobile home park. Gay Street, which was on the very eastern edge of that original plat of Southern Heights, became Gay Wood. John Street in the neighborhood and a lot of Elm Row kind of just disappeared, and only a bit of South Park remains. The pattern, though, of bigger lots to the east and smaller lots to the west remains. The western edge along Decatur Road and Hannah Street and the southern strip along Paulding Road have become more commercial than residential. Anne remembers her father owning and developing lots from Wilson Drive, which is on the south side of the big school lot, south down to Paulding Road, and I think that's the best way to think about it. My research in online property records confirms that with a series of purchases and sales of different lots, he went to work and continued building there. I haven't found documentation of why Barnes chose this neighborhood to focus his development work in, but my guess is that it was available land in a convenient location, platted by other people already, but not yet built out, and city maps of the time confirmed that. The fact that he successfully built homes for at least 24 Black families there is impressive and admirable. As we combine what the African-American Museum has learned with what Anne knows and what we have pulled from property records, we have a target list of more than 50 properties that we need to winnow down to the real list by finding documentation that the company built the home. I suspect we have some duplications, confusions of names between who built them and who lived there later, for example. We will get it straightened out. This work will be done as part of the foundational survey that we're doing with the support of the Indiana Landmarks Black Heritage Preservation Program. Barnes did not make a big deal of the barriers he faced and overcame, but they were a pretty big deal. Quote, "One of the main problems was finding a financing institution that would make loans to Negroes without using discriminatory methods and approving loans for Negroes," he said during his presentation to Hannah Stith's class during that Negro History Week program. This program was somewhat resolved after trips to Indianapolis and talking with federal authorities in charge of allocating funds to the various federal banking systems in this area. Persistent and problems are just obstacles to be overcome. He even had a dramatic confrontation with local bankers when a white client who wanted him to build his house was refused financing because he wanted to use Barnes as a contractor. With legal support and the documentation the white client was able to supply, that confrontation ended with a banker being fired and the client getting his financing and his home built by Barnes. Barnes had to work to find a materials supplier who would work with him too, successfully working with both Broadway Lumber Company and Old Fort Supply. Other problems were dealing with the city of Fort Wayne, namely the Public Board of Works, he told Hannah Stith's class. "My main problem was getting the streets open leading to the property on which I was to build the new homes. After quite a bit of legal work, we were able to get permission to open the streets." He signed contracts with city utilities for water and sewer service too, for Smith Street in 1960, for Belmont Drive in 1962 and 1964, and in the 1970s, he finally got the city of Fort Wayne to agree to honor its legal responsibility to grant a certain portion of its housing contracts to minority contractors. More problems than just business issues reared their heads. Quote, "The first house that we started building in the Smiths Additions was set afire," he told an interviewer from the Millennium Times, published by Concerned Citizens, for a retirement tribute it printed in its June 2000 issue. Quote, "Bringing more frustration and more determination to me than ever. We were later informed by the owner of the lumber company that he was contacted by other sources not to sell any lots to African Americans and not to allow Barnes Construction to get credit for materials. But the owner told the source that he didn't have anything to do with discrimination and that he was in business for people." Resolving the two problems above about bank financing the streets and utilities, was not the end of the problems, he told the Hannestis class, for there was the problem of the residents of this area and their hostile feelings about Negroes in any sizable number moving into, quote, their neighborhood, unquote. Their feelings were expressed in many ways, such as destroying the property of workmen hired to perform certain phases of the work necessary in the construction of a new house. There were several occasions when windows were broken while a house was under construction, as well as times when paint was thrown on bricks, aluminum siding, doors, and painted or plastered walls. In the Millennium Times interview, he told about the time unidentified persons blocked Smith Street off to prevent anyone from entering the new part of the addition by placing poles into the street. Quote, that brought about a civil rights confrontation. A bulldozer was then ordered to remove the poles so that Smith Street could be opened up to the new additions, he said. All of this was going on in the 50s, right here in Fort Wayne. As he closed his classroom presentation, though, he obviously did not want the children to remember only the difficulties he had encountered. Here's what he said. In conclusion, I would like to say being a Negro in a society such as ours and trying to do something to upgrade yourself as well as other Negroes, oftentimes one will encounter many problems. But problems, if handled in the proper manner, should only be stepping stones for the future which lies ahead. And the future does look brighter for each of us, he said. Mrs. Stith's thank you note said the program was a huge success. And it's important that part of the Millennium Times' reason for interviewing Barnes in 2000 was that the paper had decided to name Barnes its Father and Minority Entrepreneur of the Year. His effort and achievement were appreciated. Arch and the Fort Wayne Committee for the Indiana Landmarks Black Heritage Preservation Committee intend to continue the appreciation with more research and more recognition. So please stay tuned. And thank you very much for coming to see this presentation. It's very important to us that we spread this word and get notice out. Once again, we invite you to invest in history for our future by becoming a member and donor. You can go back to the Arch website and click on the Donate Now button, and you'll find directions there to easily do it online. Or you can call Arch's office 426-5117, and we can help you do it that way. Once again, this is a part of Arch's fun and free lecture series for 2023, Arch's gift of education to the community, made possible by volunteers and members and donors who support our operations and staff, and also supported by funding from Arch United, the Community Foundation of Greater Fort Wayne, and Indiana Humanities. And thank you to Fort Wayne Cinema Center for making its Spectator Lounge available to Arch for this program. Once again, this has been Roosevelt Barnes Sr. and the ongoing struggle against restrictive racial covenants, presented by Arch Inc. I'm Connie Haas-Zuber, the Executive Director of Arch Inc. Thank you.